The rain started just after midnight, the kind of rain that makes an entire city feel empty. Thunder rolled across the hills outside Hartford County, while police vehicles lined the entrance of one of the most expensive estates in the state. Neighbors stood behind locked gates, watching flashes of red and blue lights bounce across the windows of the Caldwell mansion, a property so famous that locals used to slow down just to stare at it. For more than 40 years, the Caldwell family represented everything people admired about old American wealth. They donated millions to hospitals, funded political campaigns, appeared on magazine covers, and built an empire stretching from luxury hotels to private investment firms. To the public, they looked untouchable. But on that night, dozens of federal investigators walked through the front doors, carrying evidence boxes, sealed warrants, and one question that nobody in the family was prepared to answer. Because hidden somewhere inside that mansion was a secret connected to a disappearance that had haunted the family for over 2 decades. And according to investigators, somebody inside the house had spent years making sure the truth never came out. The first news report aired at exactly 6:12 the next morning. At first, viewers thought it was another financial scandal involving wealthy executives hiding money overseas. But within hours, the story became something far more disturbing. Headlines began appearing across every major network in America. Billionaire dynasty under investigation. Hidden basement discovered beneath luxury estate. Former employee missing for 22 years. Then came the detail that changed everything. A retired housekeeper named Clara Reyes had walked into a federal office carrying old photographs, handwritten journals, and cassette tapes she claimed were taken from inside the Caldwell mansion in 1998. Investigators initially believed her story sounded exaggerated. But after listening to the recordings and comparing them with missing persons reports from the late 90s, they reopened a case that had quietly disappeared decades earlier. Suddenly, one of the richest families in America found themselves facing questions they thought had been buried forever. Questions about missing employees, secret payments, hidden rooms, and one violent night nobody inside the mansion wanted discussed again. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what investigators eventually uncovered inside the Caldwell estate would expose a level of deception that shocked even seasoned detectives. The deeper authorities looked into the family, the more disturbing details emerged. Former employees who once signed strict confidentiality agreements suddenly refused interviews and disappeared from public view. A former driver reportedly changed his identity and moved across the country. One accountant connected to the family died unexpectedly only months before federal agents reopened the investigation. And then there was Daniel Caldwell, the youngest son of billionaire Richard Caldwell. For years, Daniel had remained distant from his own family. Tabloids painted him as the troubled heir who wasted his fortune partying across Europe while avoiding the responsibilities of the family business. But according to sources close to the investigation, Daniel had secretly been collecting evidence against his own father for years, and investigators believed he knew far more than he publicly admitted. Richard Caldwell built his empire during the real estate explosion of the 1980s. He came from modest beginnings in Pennsylvania and transformed himself into one of the most influential businessmen on the East Coast. By the mid-90s, politicians attended his private dinners, celebrities vacationed at his resorts, and financial magazines described him as a symbol of modern American success. His wife, Eleanor Caldwell, became equally respected in elite social circles. Elegant, disciplined, and fiercely protective of the family image, Eleanor controlled nearly every aspect of the Caldwell household. Former employees later described the mansion as beautiful from the outside, but deeply uncomfortable once the doors closed. Staff members followed strict rules. Certain hallways remained locked at all times. Security cameras watched almost every room except the private West Wing, where Richard conducted confidential meetings late into the night. Employees were forbidden from discussing family matters outside the estate, and every worker signed agreements threatening lawsuits if private information ever became public. At the time, most people assumed the family simply valued privacy. Nobody imagined those rules existed for another reason entirely. Then came the disappearance in 1998. Her name was Vanessa Cole, 24 years old, originally from Ohio. She worked inside the mansion for less than 8 months before suddenly vanishing without explanation. At the time, the family claimed Vanessa had quit unexpectedly and returned home. But according to police records later uncovered by investigative journalists, Vanessa's mother filed multiple missing person reports, insisting her daughter would never disappear voluntarily. The reports went nowhere. Detectives briefly questioned members of the household before the case quietly faded from public attention. Years later, Clara Reyes claimed she remembered the exact night Vanessa disappeared. According to Clara, tension inside the mansion had been growing for weeks. Richard Caldwell had become increasingly aggressive. Eleanor appeared constantly anxious, and Daniel Caldwell had started arguing publicly with his father during dinner gatherings attended by close family friends. Clara later told investigators that on the night Vanessa vanished, she heard shouting coming from the West Wing shortly after midnight. Then she heard glass breaking, then silence. The next morning, several sections of marble flooring near the private study had been replaced without explanation. For years, Clara stayed silent because she feared what the family was capable of. She watched employees leave suddenly after asking too many questions. She witnessed attorneys arrive at the estate carrying stacks of legal documents late at night. She even claimed she once saw Richard Caldwell personally burning files in an outdoor furnace behind the mansion shortly before dawn. But the moment that haunted her most happened only days after Vanessa disappeared. While cleaning the lower-level storage area beneath the mansion, Clara discovered a locked metal door partially hidden behind shelves of wine crates. She later told investigators she heard movement coming from behind the door before a security guard ordered her upstairs immediately. The following week, the entire storage section was remodeled, and access was permanently restricted. Clara spent more than 20 years carrying that memory before finally deciding to speak. And once federal agents searched the estate themselves, they discovered something that changed the entire investigation. Hidden behind a reinforced wall beneath the mansion was a concealed underground room that did not appear on any official building plans. Inside were damaged journals, financial ledgers, burned photographs, and cassette tapes dating back more than 2 decades. One recording reportedly captured an argument between Richard Caldwell and a woman investigators believed was Vanessa Cole. Another included Eleanor Caldwell, saying the words investigators would later repeat publicly during press conferences across the country. If this gets out, the family is finished. Those 7 words transformed the investigation from a financial scandal into something much darker, because detectives no longer believed the Caldwells were simply hiding money. They believed the family had spent decades protecting a secret connected to violence, blackmail, and a disappearance that may have involved far more people than anyone originally suspected. And as investigators continued examining evidence taken from the mansion, another shocking detail emerged. Several large payments had been transferred over the years into accounts connected to former employees who abruptly left the estate after 1998. Some accepted the money and remained silent. Others disappeared entirely. But one person eventually decided to tell the truth. And, according to investigators, that decision would bring one of America's most powerful families dangerously close to collapse. As federal investigators continued searching the Caldwell estate, the atmosphere inside the mansion became unbearable. Reporters crowded the gates day and night, hoping to catch even the smallest glimpse of the family that once controlled half the city through wealth and influence alone. Helicopters circled above the property, while television anchors stood outside in heavy coats, describing the estate like it was the center of a national tragedy. For the first time in decades, Richard Caldwell could no longer control the narrative. Every newspaper in America wanted answers. Every former employee suddenly remembered strange details they once ignored. And every hidden corner of the Caldwell family history was beginning to surface all at once. But among all the chaos surrounding the investigation, one person remained unusually silent. Eleanor Caldwell had completely disappeared from public view. Friends claimed she was exhausted. Attorneys insisted she had nothing to say. Yet investigators believed Eleanor knew more than anyone else inside that mansion. Because according to Clara Reyes, Eleanor had spent years protecting secrets that were never meant to survive beyond the walls of the estate. Long before the scandal exploded across national television, Eleanor Caldwell had carefully built the image of the perfect American matriarch. She hosted charity galas attended by governors and senators. She appeared in magazines beside paintings worth millions of dollars. At public events, she smiled constantly, spoke softly, and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who believed nothing could threaten her family's position. But former staff members described a completely different woman once the cameras disappeared. Clara Reyes later explained that Eleanor controlled the mansion with absolute precision. Every employee understood the rules immediately. Never ask questions, never discuss private conversations, never enter the West Wing unless instructed directly. According to Clara, Eleanor became especially tense whenever Vanessa Cole's name was mentioned. In fact, several employees later claimed Eleanor abruptly stopped speaking during dinner one evening after hearing Richard Caldwell and Vanessa arguing behind closed doors upstairs. The next morning, Vanessa appeared shaken and unusually quiet. 3 days later, she vanished completely. The deeper investigators examined Vanessa Cole's disappearance, the stranger the timeline became. Official records claimed Vanessa resigned voluntarily before leaving the state. But detectives discovered there were no airline tickets, no hotel bookings, no employment records, and no confirmed sightings after the night she disappeared from the mansion. Even more disturbing, investigators learned someone had continued depositing money into a bank account under Vanessa's name for nearly 11 years after she was reported missing. The account remained mostly untouched except for small cash withdrawals made from different cities across the country. Detectives initially believed Vanessa might still be alive, but forensic accountants eventually concluded the withdrawals were likely designed to create the illusion that she had disappeared willingly. That discovery changed the entire direction of the case. Suddenly, investigators were no longer looking at a missing persons report from the late 90s. They were examining what appeared to be a carefully organized cover-up involving financial manipulation, false records, and multiple individuals connected directly to the Caldwell family. Then investigators uncovered another name buried deep inside old employment files. Thomas Grayson, a private security consultant hired by Richard Caldwell during the late 1990s. Former employees described Grayson as intimidating, aggressive, and fiercely loyal to the family. He rarely spoke to staff members and handled sensitive matters personally. According to Clara Reyes, Thomas Grayson appeared everywhere after Vanessa disappeared. He supervised renovations in the lower level of the mansion, monitored incoming phone calls, and personally escorted certain employees off the property after private meetings with Richard Caldwell. But shortly after federal agents reopened the case, Thomas Grayson disappeared completely. His house sat empty. His phones were disconnected. Even former associates claimed they had not heard from him in years. Investigators believed Grayson could hold the key to understanding what really happened inside the mansion that night in 1998. Because according to one former employee, Grayson once admitted something during a late-night argument that nobody fully understood at the time. He reportedly said, "If Richard goes down, everybody goes down." Meanwhile, Daniel Caldwell finally agreed to speak publicly after weeks of avoiding reporters. His appearance shocked viewers across the country. Gone was the polished image of a billionaire heir raised in privilege. Daniel looked exhausted, emotionally drained, and visibly frightened. During the interview, he admitted he had spent most of his adult life trying to escape the influence of his father. He described Richard Caldwell as controlling, manipulative, and obsessed with protecting the family name at any cost. But when the interviewer asked Daniel directly whether he believed Vanessa Cole had been harmed inside the mansion, Daniel paused for several seconds before answering. Then he said something investigators would later describe as one of the most important moments in the entire case. "I think my father convinced himself he was protecting the family," Daniel said quietly. "But somewhere along the way, protecting the family became more important than protecting people." That statement immediately dominated headlines nationwide, because for the first time, someone inside the Caldwell family was no longer denying the possibility that something terrible had happened behind closed doors. But Daniel Caldwell was still hiding information of his own. Federal investigators later confirmed Daniel secretly met with authorities nearly 8 months before the public investigation began. During those meetings, he reportedly handed over copies of financial records, private correspondence, and photographs taken inside restricted areas of the mansion years earlier. One photograph immediately captured investigators' attention. It showed a narrow hallway beneath the estate leading toward a reinforced metal door. Written across the back of the image in faded ink were 5 words that sent chills through detectives reviewing the evidence. "This should never exist downstairs." Authorities later matched the handwriting to Daniel Caldwell himself. Investigators believed Daniel had known about the hidden underground room for years, but remained silent out of fear and loyalty to his mother. According to sources close to the investigation, Daniel eventually came forward only after discovering evidence suggesting Vanessa Cole's disappearance was connected to financial crimes reaching far beyond the Caldwell estate itself. As media pressure intensified, more former employees slowly began contacting investigators. Some refused to appear publicly, but agreed to confidential interviews. Others described incidents they had kept secret for decades. One former chef recalled seeing blood near the lower staircase on the same night Vanessa disappeared. Another employee claimed Richard Caldwell ordered all security footage erased the following morning. A former chauffeur even admitted he drove Eleanor Caldwell to a private meeting with attorneys less than 48 hours after Vanessa vanished. But perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from a retired groundskeeper who worked at the estate for nearly 15 years. He claimed construction crews arrived unexpectedly 1 week after Vanessa disappeared and spent 3 nights working beneath the mansion. Workers were allegedly forbidden from speaking to staff and entered through a private service entrance monitored personally by Thomas Grayson. The groundskeeper later told investigators he remembered hearing drilling noises beneath the house long after midnight, while Richard Caldwell watched silently from the balcony above the garden. Then, another shocking revelation surfaced. Investigators discovered Vanessa Cole may have been involved in a secret relationship with Richard Caldwell himself. Handwritten letters recovered from the hidden underground room suggested the two had been communicating privately for months before her disappearance. Some letters appeared affectionate. Others sounded fearful and desperate. In one damaged note believed to have been written by Vanessa shortly before she vanished, she reportedly wrote, "You promised you would protect me. Now I'm afraid of what they'll do if anyone finds out." Detectives immediately began examining the possibility that Vanessa knew information capable of destroying the Caldwell family publicly. And, according to Clara Reyes, Eleanor Caldwell became increasingly unstable after learning about the relationship. Clara later recalled hearing violent arguments late at night, followed by long periods where nobody inside the mansion spoke during meals. Employees reportedly avoided eye contact with one another, and several abruptly resigned within weeks. Yet despite the growing tension, nobody contacted authorities, because everyone working inside the Caldwell estate understood one terrifying reality. The Caldwells were powerful enough to make problems disappear. And for more than 20 years, that is exactly what seemed to happen. By the summer of the investigation, the Caldwell family empire was collapsing faster than anyone expected. Investors began pulling millions from Richard Caldwell's companies, while political figures quietly distanced themselves from the family they once proudly stood beside at charity dinners and campaign events. Television networks aired special reports every night discussing hidden evidence, missing employees, and the possibility that one of America's most respected billionaire dynasties had spent decades protecting a terrible secret. But inside the Caldwell mansion, the pressure had become almost unbearable. According to sources close to the investigation, Eleanor Caldwell barely left her private bedroom for days at a time. Richard Caldwell stopped appearing at corporate meetings entirely, and Daniel Caldwell remained under constant protection after investigators warned him that several people connected to the case had started receiving anonymous threats. Yet despite all the attention surrounding the family, authorities still lacked one thing they desperately needed: proof of exactly what happened to Vanessa Cole on the night she disappeared in 1998. Without that proof, the Caldwells could continue denying everything publicly, while their attorneys attacked the credibility of former employees one by one. Then investigators received a phone call that changed the case forever. The call came from Arizona. A woman living outside Phoenix claimed she recognized Vanessa Cole's photograph during a national news segment about the investigation. According to the woman, a quiet neighbor named Natalie Warren looked almost identical to the missing housekeeper everyone believed vanished more than 2 decades earlier. Detectives initially approached the claim carefully because similar tips had flooded investigators since the story became national news. But this time was different. When authorities examined old identification records connected to Natalie Warren, they discovered major inconsistencies dating back to the early 2000s. The Social Security number attached to her identity belonged to someone who died years earlier. Employment records appeared incomplete. Medical documents contained conflicting signatures, and perhaps most shocking of all, financial analysts discovered small wire transfers connected to shell companies, once linked to Richard Caldwell, had been sent repeatedly to Natalie Warren's accounts over several years. Investigators immediately traveled to Arizona, fearing they were about to uncover the biggest twist in the entire case. When detectives finally approached Natalie Warren at her home, neighbors described her reaction as immediate panic. Witnesses later said she appeared physically frozen after hearing investigators mention the name Vanessa Cole. According to official reports, she denied everything at first. She claimed she had never heard of the Caldwell family and insisted authorities had mistaken her for someone else. But after hours of questioning, Natalie reportedly broke down emotionally and asked investigators one devastating question: did Richard finally tell the truth? That single sentence confirmed what authorities had suspected for weeks. Vanessa Cole was alive, but the truth surrounding her disappearance turned out to be far more disturbing than anyone imagined. According to Vanessa's statement, she did not disappear voluntarily because she wanted a new life. She disappeared because powerful people convinced her she had no other choice. Vanessa claimed she became pregnant after a secret relationship with Richard Caldwell, and later threatened to expose him after learning he had lied repeatedly about leaving Eleanor Caldwell. When Eleanor discovered the affair, chaos inside the mansion exploded beyond control. Vanessa later told investigators the night of her disappearance began with an argument inside Richard Caldwell's private study. She claimed Eleanor confronted both of them after discovering letters hidden in Richard's office. The confrontation quickly became violent. Furniture shattered. Glass broke across the floor. Vanessa attempted to leave the mansion, but Thomas Grayson allegedly blocked the exit and ordered her back upstairs. According to Vanessa, Richard panicked as the situation spiraled beyond his control. He begged her not to contact police or reporters because public exposure would destroy everything he had built. Then came the moment investigators had spent months trying to understand. Vanessa claimed Eleanor Caldwell offered her a deal: money, a new identity, and complete financial support in exchange for disappearing permanently and never contacting anyone connected to the family again. Vanessa said she initially refused, but after Thomas Grayson allegedly threatened her directly and warned that powerful people would never allow the scandal to become public, she became terrified. Within 48 hours, Vanessa was secretly moved across state lines under a false identity, while the Caldwell family publicly claimed she had simply resigned and left voluntarily. The revelation stunned the entire country. Millions of viewers who followed the investigation suddenly realized the truth was even darker than they imagined. Vanessa Cole had not been murdered beneath the mansion. Instead, she had spent 22 years living in silence under a false identity, while one of America's wealthiest families erased her existence completely. But even after Vanessa finally came forward publicly, investigators believed parts of the story remained hidden. Because, according to evidence recovered from the underground room, the cover-up extended far beyond protecting an affair. Financial records suggested Richard Caldwell used shell corporations and secret accounts to silence employees and manipulate investigations for years. Detectives also uncovered evidence that local officials may have accepted payments connected to the original disappearance case in 1998. Suddenly, the scandal transformed into something much larger than one family protecting their reputation. Authorities were now examining corruption, involving businessmen, attorneys, political figures, and former law enforcement officers connected to the Caldwell empire over several decades. Then came the moment that permanently destroyed what remained of the Caldwell family image. During a nationally televised hearing, Richard Caldwell finally appeared before investigators publicly for the first time since the scandal erupted. Viewers expected denial, anger, or another carefully prepared statement from attorneys. Instead, Richard appeared exhausted and emotionally broken. His hands trembled as investigators presented photographs, financial records, and transcripts recovered during the investigation. For several minutes, Richard refused to answer questions directly. Then, one senator asked him whether protecting the family name had become more important than protecting innocent people. The room fell silent. Richard stared downward before quietly responding, "I spent my entire life building something I thought would last forever. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that losing the truth was better than losing everything else." That statement immediately spread across every major network in America. For many viewers, it sounded less like a defense and more like a confession from a man who finally realized the damage caused by decades of fear, pride, and control. But the most emotional moment came days later when Vanessa Cole agreed to speak publicly for the first time. Sitting across from an investigative journalist, Vanessa described what it felt like watching the world believe she was dead while she lived in complete isolation under another name. She admitted there were nights she nearly contacted her family, but feared the consequences if she exposed the Caldwells publicly. She described years spent constantly looking over her shoulder, terrified somebody connected to the family might eventually silence her permanently if she spoke out. Then the interviewer asked Vanessa whether she believed Richard Caldwell ever truly cared about her. Vanessa paused for several seconds before answering softly, "I think Richard cared more about protecting his legacy than he cared about any human being around him." Millions watching across the country fell silent hearing those words. Because after months of investigations, hidden evidence, shocking revelations, and media frenzy, the story no longer felt like a mystery involving wealth and corruption alone. It became a story about fear, power, and what people are willing to sacrifice to protect the image they spent their entire lives creating. In the months that followed, the Caldwell empire collapsed piece by piece. Multiple properties were sold. Corporate partnerships disappeared. Foundations, carrying the family name, quietly removed Richard and Eleanor from leadership positions. Thomas Grayson was eventually located living under an alias in another state, and later agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges connected to obstruction and financial crimes. Eleanor Caldwell never fully recovered from the public exposure. According to people close to the family, she isolated herself almost entirely from society after Vanessa came forward publicly. Daniel Caldwell permanently severed ties with the remaining family businesses, and later released a statement admitting he regretted staying silent for so many years. But despite everything investigators uncovered, one question continued haunting the public long after the headlines faded away. How many powerful families had secrets hidden just as deeply as the Caldwells? Because if one billionaire dynasty could erase a woman's identity for more than 20 years while maintaining the image of perfection publicly, what else might still remain hidden behind the walls of America's wealthiest homes? And maybe the most unsettling part of this entire story is realizing the truth almost stayed buried forever. If Clara Reyes never walked into that federal office carrying those old tapes and photographs, Vanessa Cole might still be living under another name today, while the Caldwell family continued appearing at charity events, pretending nothing ever happened. One frightened housekeeper changed everything simply by deciding she could no longer carry the weight of silence alone. And in the end, it wasn't money, political influence, or fear that finally destroyed the Caldwell empire. It was the truth, quiet, patient, waiting for the moment someone finally had the courage to speak. For nearly a year after the investigation ended, the Caldwell mansion remained completely empty. The gates stayed locked. The fountains stopped running. Dust gathered across the enormous windows that once reflected luxury and power back at the outside world. Locals in Hartford County began treating the estate like a haunted landmark. People drove slowly past the property late at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of movement behind the curtains. But the house remained silent. Eventually, county officials ordered parts of the mansion sealed after structural engineers discovered hidden renovations beneath the lower level connected to the underground room investigators uncovered during the raid. Demolition crews later admitted they felt uncomfortable working inside the estate because personal belongings still remained exactly where the Caldwell family left them. Dinner tables were still set. Portraits still hung across the hallways. One worker claimed a grandfather clock inside Richard Caldwell's private office continued chiming every evening, despite no electricity running through parts of the mansion anymore. But perhaps the strangest discovery came during the final property inspection before the estate was scheduled for auction. Inside a locked cabinet hidden behind shelves in Eleanor Caldwell's private library, investigators discovered a final sealed envelope addressed only to Daniel Caldwell. According to reports leaked months later, Daniel initially refused to discuss the contents publicly, but sources close to the family claimed the letter contained a handwritten confession from Eleanor herself. In it, she reportedly admitted that the night Vanessa Cole disappeared changed the entire family forever. Eleanor allegedly wrote that she spent years convincing herself she was protecting her children, her marriage, and the legacy Richard Caldwell built from nothing. But over time, she realized the family stopped feeling like a family at all. It became an institution built entirely around fear and silence. One line from the letter reportedly haunted Daniel more than anything else. Eleanor wrote, "The truth entered this house long before investigators ever did. We were simply too afraid to face it." Daniel never released the full letter publicly. Some believe he wanted to protect what remained of his mother's dignity. Others believe parts of the confession were too damaging to reveal, even after everything the world already knew. Then came the detail that reignited public fascination with the case one final time. Weeks after the Caldwell estate officially sold to a private developer, demolition workers uncovered an old tape recorder hidden inside a wall near Richard Caldwell's former study. The tape was badly damaged, but audio specialists managed to recover several minutes of conversation. According to leaked transcripts, the recording captured Richard Caldwell speaking privately with Thomas Grayson shortly after Vanessa Cole disappeared in 1998. Richard allegedly sounded exhausted and emotionally unstable while discussing the growing panic inside the mansion. At one point during the recording, Thomas Grayson asked Richard whether Vanessa could still be trusted to remain silent forever. Richard responded with a sentence that immediately spread across social media and news broadcasts across America. "People don't stay silent because they're loyal," Richard reportedly said. "They stay silent because they're afraid." Investigators later confirmed the tape was authentic. And for many people following the story, those words explained everything about the Caldwell family more clearly than any courtroom testimony ever could. But even after all the evidence, all the confessions, and all the media attention, one mystery surrounding the case still remains unsolved to this day. Investigators never fully discovered who originally leaked the first anonymous tip that reopened Vanessa Cole's disappearance after more than 2 decades. Officially, Clara Reyes was the first witness to cooperate publicly, but federal agents later admitted they received unsigned documents and photographs months before Clara ever came forward. Those materials reportedly included detailed maps of the underground room beneath the mansion and copies of financial transactions linked to Richard Caldwell's secret accounts. Some investigators quietly believed Eleanor Caldwell herself may have leaked the information after years of emotional exhaustion. Others suspected Daniel Caldwell orchestrated everything long before the public investigation began. A few even believed Thomas Grayson secretly turned against Richard after decades of protecting the family's secrets. But no definitive answer was ever confirmed. And maybe that uncertainty is what continues making the story feel so unsettling years later. Richard Caldwell spent the final years of his life almost completely removed from public society. Former associates described him as emotionally broken. After the collapse of the empire, he dedicated his entire existence to building. He reportedly stopped attending business meetings, rarely left his residence, and avoided interviews entirely. Some people viewed him as a monster who manipulated everyone around him to protect his power. Others believed he became trapped inside the very system of wealth and control he spent decades creating. Eleanor Caldwell disappeared from public life completely after the investigation ended. Daniel Caldwell eventually relocated overseas and refused nearly every interview request connected to the scandal. And Vanessa Cole, after finally reclaiming her real identity publicly, chose to live quietly away from media attention. In one of her final public statements, she said something that many viewers still remember long after the headlines faded away. "The hardest part wasn't losing my name," Vanessa said softly. "The hardest part was realizing how easy it became for powerful people to convince everyone else I never mattered. And maybe that is the real reason stories like this continue haunting people long after they end. Because beneath the money, the headlines, the corruption, and the secrets, this was never just a story about one wealthy family protecting their image. It was a story about silence, about fear, about what happens when power becomes more important than truth. The Caldwell family spent decades believing they could control reality itself simply because they controlled wealth, influence, and perception. For a long time, they succeeded. People admired them, defended them, envied them. Meanwhile, the truth sat hidden behind locked doors, waiting for somebody brave enough to uncover it. And in the end, the empire didn't collapse because investigators were smarter or because journalists worked harder. It collapsed because one frightened woman finally decided she could no longer live with the weight of silence anymore. Even now, some former residents near the old Caldwell estate claim the property still feels unsettling after dark. The mansion itself no longer stands the way it once did, but locals say the long empty road leading toward the hills remains strangely quiet at night. Perhaps it's only the imagination of a town that lived beside secrets for too many years. Or perhaps some stories never fully leave the places where they began. Because despite every confession, every investigation, and every public revelation, one question still lingers long after the case officially closed. How many other powerful families are still hiding truths nobody has uncovered yet? And if Clara Reyes never found the courage to speak, would anyone have ever known the truth about the Caldwells at all?